So I'm here at the CPHC annual forum with Bill Randolph from UNSW City Futures, who's just given the keynote about, the suburbanisation of inequality and the links between inequality, health and urban planning. So if you could give us a little headline summary of your talk.
Okay, in a soundbite, in a tweet.
Yep.
Trump tweet.
Yep.
Okay, well, what I tried to do really was firstly to reflect on the fact that urban planning and social housing, the sort of things that I've spent a long time looking at, are basically linked with population health and epidemiology through our kind of joint origins in the 19th century, concerns about disadvantage, insanitary slum conditions, and the state of very low income people. We both come out of that kind of place together, and whilst we've kind of gone our own separate ways, we are intimately linked in that area. So that was number one. The second issue was really about the growth of inequality, and that's central to the centre's here's interest in equity. We become much less equal over the last 30 years after a whole period when we became probably more equal, or at least opportunities we became more equal over that period, in the post-war period. That's changing rapidly. And then the third bit to try and bring it together was this issue around suburbanisation of disadvantage. 40 years ago, 30 years ago, the inner cities of our cities were where disadvantage was largely concentrated. Now it's the suburbs. There's been the spatial inversion has happened. We now have disadvantage as a suburban issue, not as an inner city one. And then there's the things that fall out of that, particularly in terms of poor health and health provision.
Yeah, so what are the implications, I suppose, of this, decentralisation of inequality, of people being fragmented away from the city?
Well, I mean, the obvious ones are distance from where the good jobs are, so you're more distant from where the services are. I mean, a lot of our old hospitals, of course, where are they? They're in the inner city where they were built. A lot of the service provision is probably not quite in the right place. The concentrations of disadvantage in the suburbs are actually less concentrated in one way because they're dispersed in low density housing stock, some of which is mixed up with all sorts of different stuff. So there's an issue about just the physicality of the density out there, which means that provision of services is much more difficult perhaps. Getting access to services. If you don't have a car, how do you get about? If you do have a car, it's expensive. You often have a very old car if you're poor, which breaks down and expensive to run, all the rest of it. So there are multiple locational disadvantages which compound the social and economic ones that people face in the suburbs now.
And what are some of the sort of issues for health? I think you touched on obesity, things like that.
Yeah, well, obviously, obesity is the kind of big epidemic of the suburbs. I would argue that it's perhaps not the suburbs that have caused obesity, but it's the social context in which the people who are now in the suburbs find themselves, and the pressures that they're faced with, the difficulties and the cost of getting good food, all the rest of it. Yes, maybe you could say the suburbs engender inactivity, but hey, most houses in the suburbs have gardens. They have somewhere to run about if you're a kid. So it's not the physical form of the suburbs which is an issue here, and that's a point perhaps I should have made stronger in the presentation. And the alternative, the density that's being promoted as an antidote to the obese suburbs. Well, hey, look at those. What are they full of? They're not full of 50-year-olds or 60-year-olds. They're full of 25, 30-year-olds. Yes, they're less obese. Yes, most of them are from middle class or more wealthy, active populations. They don't come from the groups of folks who suffer from obesity problems for all sorts of reasons. So our city is kind of shuffling people about. The inner suburbs are getting a good rap, the goat's cheese curtain and all the rest of it, but it's because it's the sort of people who are drawn to the inner suburbs. The outer suburbs are places where other folks are being excluded to, who have less chance opportunity, less life opportunities. They may be associated more with those health stresses, obesity, increased alcohol consumption, other psychological stresses, which we saw the maps on the chart. So there's a complex interplay of issues that are going on here that are not necessarily physically determined by the type of house or the type of neighbourhood you live in, but it's more to do with who you are.
And you talk about push and pull factors. Could you touch on those?
Yeah, well, the inner cities, we know, are where the new economic dynamic jobs are being created. 50, 60 years ago, in fact, during most of the 20th century, there was an outward movement of jobs. The old inner city factories closed down, new ones went out into the suburbs and beyond. The population moved out with it to new homes being built in those areas for all sorts of reasons, whatever. We've seen that change. The new jobs are not space intensive, they're not factory warehouses or whatever. They're in offices, they're in smaller places, they're knowledge intensive. So the jobs have come back into the inner city. Gentrification has been associated with that, has pretty much cleared out the inner city of those old pockets of low income private housing. There's a few public housing estates left, and they're dwindling in number, as we know. So what's happened is those folks have moved out into the suburbs. The private rental market has gone out with them either at the same time or there's a coincidence there you can't ignore. So you can see how the city is restructured over time. I'm not sure if that's answered your question. But,
you spoke about pull factors and push factors. So pull factors being, and this was an interesting point you made, that it's people are going out to where there's affordable housing.
Yeah.
And to segue from that, you were talking about this idea that public housing gets a bad rap, but actually private rentals are where deep poverty is being experienced.
Yeah, and where most people who are experiencing that now live. You know, it might have been public housing 30 years ago, it isn't anymore. And you know, on the plus side for public housing, no matter what you might think of it, there are efforts to try and redevelop those estates to replace the old public housing with new public and social housing, with some additional affordable housing as well. So there's some positive things going on there, which should help those populations. Outside in the private market, there's nobody out there to help you, and that's where I think we should be looking more intently at what the social, health and economic issues are going to be in the next 20 to 30 years.
That's a big question. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm not terribly hopeful, because a lot of where us as planners are thinking of doing a lot of work isn't in those areas. If you look at some of the recent strategic plans for Sydney, there's a lot of activity around corridors and town centres and activity centres. The rest of the maps are just white, like there's nothing going on there. And planners have that mindset that it's all going to be concentrated. We need to think out planning and what we're doing in the suburbs, which are getting on with their own business. And a lot of it is not particularly good business. It's where, as we've seen in the maps, those disadvantaged households are piling up. We need to do something about that as planners as well as social planners.
So what can planning do? I mean, you know, it's a chicken and egg question.
Oh, right. I'm just an academic. I don't have any answers. I just, you know.
Pose questions.
This is a hard question. Well, I think there's certainly an issue about the distribution of redevelopment. You can, as we've seen in some of the, I mentioned, there is activity going on in these disadvantaged suburbs. It's not all bad news. Some of them are places where people arrive and then launch themselves or their families and get on to do better things. A lot of those people actually do better things in those communities. So they'll buy an old fibro, they'll knock it down and they'll build a home for their family, a new home. So that stuff is going on, and we shouldn't ignore all that. You could look at the older people who are living in those communities. Yes, they've got an asset, but what's their alternative? They're offered a unit in a block of flats in a town centre. They don't necessarily want to go there, or a retirement village up the coast. Where do they want to retire to? They want to retire in situ in their own communities. We could do a lot more about building and retooling at a medium density redevelopment in those communities, which would allow people to move into new homes, free up their old homes that could be improved or whatever by families who need to live in a house on a bit of a block. Or you could put those blocks together and do some medium density development. We don't all have to live in 20-storey towers around railway stations. We had a previous planning minister who talked about the missing middle in Sydney. He was absolutely right. I was really impressed by that, actually. I mean, we don't get many planning ministers who have a PhD in environmental planning. He was one, we don't have him anymore. But the missing middle is something which we could be looking as a planning tool to help renovate and reinvigorate some of these areas. Build in affordable housing into it, absolutely critical. There's a lot of argument about inclusionary zoning. There's a new planning tool. We need that right across Sydney. We need some of the subsidies to help build that affordable housing, of course. So as planners, we should agitate much more loudly for that. But yeah, planning can help. Inclusionary zoning, medium density development, affordable housing requirements across the city. Those sorts of things could help alleviate some of those stressed suburbs.
Thanks very much for your time.
Right.